Hello. Now this could be a long video. There has been all this banking and central banking problems with Krugman, and it's opened up and blown up, and it's being shown that an awful lot of top economists really don't know what they're talking about when it comes to banking and central banking. So via Edward Harrison of Credit Write-Downs, I'm going to use his summation of everything to do a mystical summation of everything. So this is what this probably quite long video is going to be all about. So you are duly warned. Right. Progress on the Monetary Policy and Banking Debate by Edward Harrison at Credit Write-Downs. The link is here if you want to go and look at his words while listening to the mystic talking his words. We seem to be moving forward with this discussion on monetary policy, banking and reserves. Indeed we do. John Carney does a good job at summarising, if you're following on the link, that's CNBC, John Carney, good man, some of the initial forays into this back and forth. I am going to try my hand at framing the discussion here using my own analysis of the comments iteratively, with the assistance of more comments, of course. Where there are mistakes, I will fix them accordingly. The last post I wrote, these are all links, and a follow-on post by Tim Hickey at Mike Norman's blog get at the heart of the debate, and so I will try to characterize what is being said. Paragraph heading Framing we have been living in a world predominated by floating exchange rates. Floating exchange rates, I have yen, you have dollar. The exchange rate floats up every day between the two. You find the rate on Yahoo Finance to see what the rate at that current moment is, but it floats up and down all the time. So, floating exchange rates and currency non-convertibility for 40 years now. Nobody has been able to go in and demand gold for their currency for 40 years plus. Nevertheless, most economists in the world seems to take a fixed exchange rate, Bretton Woods or gold standard view of money and banking. They are out of date. In that world, as Warren Mosler quipped, bank lending is reserve constrained with the interest rate and endogenous variable via bank competition for reserves. Now that is a quip, which we are not going to go anywhere near. Right, moving very quickly on. I put it this way in December. This is Ed Harrison. In the old gold convertible system, the central bank had to jack up rates to prevent an outflow of gold. Okay, so in the Great Depression, people in America were stopped from converting to gold. 1971, countries were stopped converting to gold. In the old gold convertible system, the central bank had to jack up rates to prevent an outflow of gold. So, before the people were blocked, they could go to the bank if they had no faith in the currency or that particular bank's solvency or whatever, and say, give me my gold, and the bank would give them the gold. That was stopped then. Then there was the period where the people were stopped, but the country, France for example, if they had no faith in the currency of the dollar and they were holding great wadges of it, could say to the Fed, we have these holdings of dollars. We want you to convert them to the equivalent amount of gold bars at $30-something a ounce. Put those bars on a ship and sail them to Paris. On both occasions, the bank, for the people, before it was stopped, could say to the person, hey, listen guy, how about if I give you 2% extra in interest and you hold the cash? And the country could say to France, hey France, don't do that. How about if I give you 2% extra, 3% extra of interest rate just to hold the cash, leave the gold out of it? And the person or the country could say, yeah, all right, or ooh, okay then, whatever. But the central bank had to jack up rates, interest rates, to prevent an outflow of gold. Generally, interest rates would have to go up, and people then would stay with the cash and not convert to gold. Interest rates were the release valve. But in those old days, only by adjusting the gold peg, i.e. depreciating the currency, could countries under attack get away with low rates once the vigilantes were onto them. In other words, you could try that, but in the end your currency would get depreciated anyway. That's what happened during the Great Depression, and once the conversion was broken, the currency depreciated and depression lessened immediately. Yeah? Yeah. Today the release valve is always the currency, because the gold is no longer a tether. So currency gives way and not interest rates. What this in effect means for the domestic banking system is that in a non-convertible, goldy stuff, floating exchange rate, yen, dollar, whatever, system, lending is not reserve constrained. Now we've got a bit of a flip-flop between systems here, but let's just go with it. Ed knows what he's talking about. As banks can create reserves by making a loan that creates a deposit. This is the spewing out thing that I keep saying. Ooh. They make a loan, the liability side of their balance sheet has a deposit on it. The deposit is taken out and it goes out into the world. But as long as all banks are doing it, those deposits will be going out of Bank A, but Bank C, D, B and D will all be spewing these out, and the deposits will come back in again, filling the reserve gap up. I might have to go into that again later. Any one institution can always borrow reserves from other banks or from the Fed itself if it finds itself short of reserves. See the BIS paper. They do or did find themselves short of reserves because they used to lend to an absolute limit. But the reserves, whole reserves in the US Fed system, was only 50 billion. The reserve amount was a paltry small amount for the whole banking system, 50 billion, almost nothing. But because they were gung-ho before the crisis and crash, they wanted to use up everything and get it all lent out, and if it wasn't lent out, to buy assets with it. Okay, and we'll come to what that all means soon. The US government, as monopoly issuer of its own sovereign currency, has given the Fed monopoly power in the market for base money. Well, it'll all explain itself, honest it will. The Fed then exercises this monopoly power by targeting the overnight rate for money, which the Fed funds rate, which is the Fed's funds target rate. That is to say, the Fed targets a rate or price, not a quantity. Now, in I think number 3 Krugman article, where he got this wrong as well, he's been getting absolutely everything wrong. Or was this in number 5? Doesn't really matter. Okay, this does need explanation. Ed has a go at it, but I'll do a pre-explanation as well. Banks do this fountain lending, and they're filling their own reserves back up. So they rarely really need to get... They're rarely short of reserves at the end of the day. But if they are short of reserves at the end of the day, first they will go to their brother and sister banks and say, I need so many billion, do you want to lend it to me overnight? And they go yes or no. And, right, how should we do this? Whether they say yes or no will be predicated on the overall level of reserves that there are in the Fed system. If the Fed has made it so there are lots of reserves in the reserve system. The first bank you phone up and say, can I have an overnight loan? They'll say, yeah, no problem. And they say, how much? And they'll give you a damn good price for it, because they know at Bank B that Bank C, D, E and F have all got reserves and would all be giving a good price. So B gives a good price. If Bank A is not happy, it can go C, D, E, F, but the banks generally know, because that's the way they are, what the price they should be quoting is. And if there are lots of reserves, the price they charge to A overnight will be a low interest rate. Right. But if there are very few reserves in either A, B, C, D, E, F, G or any of them, then A knows that when he picks up the phone, and B knows it when he answers, and B will say, yeah, I've got some funds I can lend you overnight, but you're going to have to pay this much in interest, which A goes, that's rather a lot, but knows that C hasn't got any, D hasn't got any, E and F might have some, but would only say the same thing as B has said. In other words, when the reserve amounts are low, the interest rate is high. Right. Now, when we know what the Fed's balance sheet looks like when it comes to reserves. The reserves go flat along the bottom at 50 billion and then hit the crisis and go whoosh up to trillions and trillions and trillions. Now, what was it? When it hit a trillion, did it get 1.5 trillion? Something like that. Huge amounts. So you can phone up anybody you like and they'll say, yeah, reserves, but you don't need to phone up because you'll have your own reserves. But you can imagine if the first person you did phone up and say, well, yeah, I'll lend you overnight for nothing. And that is what the Fed funds target rate is. Nothing. Just about nothing. Do I do the interest on reserves? I'll do it quickly. And it would be nothing because everyone's got sodding reserves. So the interest rate charge between banks would be nothing. The central bank doesn't want it at nothing, so it actually pays 0.25% on reserves anyway. So nobody's going to charge nothing when they can put their interest rate, their reserves with the Fed and get 0.25 anyway. So it won't be nothing when they can get 0.25. It'll be between 0 and 0.25 if you ever want to really borrow, but you won't because you will never need to. But that keeps the Fed funds rate from falling below 0. Yeah, it's a whole different subject, and I've explained it before and didn't do it very well there, but I've got to move on. So I don't even know where we are here now. So the Fed then exercises this monopoly power by targeting the overnight rate for money, the Fed funds rate, the Fed funds target rate. That is to say, the Fed targets rate or price, not quantity. Okay, now this is the tricky one again that Krugman got wrong. Price, not quantity. The Fed sitting there with two monitors open, two screens open. On the left-hand one, like the right-hand one, on the left-hand one, it's got all the reserves that the member banks have got with itself, the Fed. On the other screen is the amount that it is monitoring that the banks are lending to each other overnight. Now, that's the target rate that it really takes notice of. The reserves, I'll just give you wild numbers. Then, as I say, there never will be these wild numbers. They could be 900 billion in reserves, or they could be 90 billion in reserves. The Fed's really not bothered on that screen. It doesn't matter what the reserve number is, the quantity is. It's only targeting the rate. So, if the overnight rate starts creeping above its target rate band, you know, there's a little bit of margin because it's never exact. If it starts creeping up, that means that the amount of reserves in the Fed held are too low. Now, it might be 900 billion or it might be 90 billion, but if it's 900 billion, the Fed will try and get it up to 950 billion. And if it's a 90 billion, it'll try and get it up to 95 billion. And then the interest charge between the banks will come down. It's not the overall amount, although it will be to a certain extent, but very hard to calculate. It'll be, all you need is obviously a little bit more. So we get to the horrible problem, well, how does the Fed get it to be a little bit more or a little bit less? It does repo or reverse repo. It has assets, let's say treasuries, which it will be using, and it says to the banks, it gives them offers that they can't refuse. Would you like to buy a treasury at this rate? And this amount it would be. And the banks say, yes, please. Or if the banks have got treasuries, which they've always got, the Fed will say, I would like you to, I would like to buy those treasuries off you. And the thing used on the Fed side is the Fed's reserve account and the bank's reserves account. So the Fed can pull and push by buying and selling treasuries. The banks are using their reserve account for buying and selling treasuries. So the Fed, by buying and selling treasuries to the banks, can make that number 950 or 850 or 95 or 85. And it doesn't matter. Then the central bank will go, okay, look at this screen. Yep, that's brought the interest rate the banks charge themselves overnight down a little bit. Want it down a bit more. So if we want it down a bit more, we need them to have a few more reserves. So we will, what will they do? They need money out there. So the Fed says to the banks, I will buy these treasuries off you at a very advantageous price. The banks say yes. The Fed takes the treasuries. A few more money things go into the reserves of the banks. It goes up to 975 and bingo, the target rate is hit. And then that is what the Fed always does. The Bank of England does, the Bank of Japan does, most all banks do, which we'll learn later. And we'll get some more Ed explanation going here. Almost all modern central banks of today operate with explicit interest rate targets. Interest rate targets, not where it said the Fed targets the rate or price, not the quantity. 950, 90, doesn't matter. Just get the rate right. Because the banks then know that rate that they will use as reserves will enter into their loan making decisions. Okay. Any monopolist can only control either price or quantity, not both. It's just, it's very like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, for those of you that are up with that sort of thing. It's just like it. Okay. Now, central banks could target something else, like reserves, to transmit money policy into the economy, and they have done so in the past. This is what Krugman was talking about. One of the mistakes he made, the Fed targeted reserves, the quantity, from 1979 to 1982, and what the Fed found was that it only had a controlling influence. It was really a shocking way of doing it on base money, because targeting the monetary base meant volatility in the interest rate. They were saying, all right, we'll target 125 billion in reserves, but different things were happening in the economy, pulling and pushing the banks, and the interest rate was going up and down like this. And basically, they lost control of it and had to go back to what they did before, which was targeting the rate, the interest rate. And that's obviously what they do now, and most all other central banks do. What the Fed found was it only had the controlling influence on base money, because targeting the monetary base meant volatility in interest rates. This is an ECB discussion paper, which I'm sure you're going to link and read. Not. But more importantly, because bank loans create deposits, this great fountain affair, that actually need reserves to maintain the integrity of the payment system, the Fed is forced to supply them according to its legal mandate. People have asked, well, if you don't borrow off a bank overnight, then you go to the Fed and you just, at a certain interest rate, you borrow your reserves off the Fed if you need to. People have said, well, why do the Fed always do it? Because if the Fed then said, no, not me, I'm not lending you any, then the interest rate charged by the interbanks will go up. You know, the extra reserves won't be created. There'll be the rate will go up interbank, and the Fed has lost control of its target rate. It must give those reserves out every single time, and the banks, knowing that they have a uniform system to play with, and with a uniform system out there, that is what the Fed can target to get the target interest rate right. The Fed funds target rate, and then make the Fed funds rate right. But if it started refusing, it would be then using it. That would be another lever, which would be making the interest rate out there so much more volatile. It always gives the reserves out because that keeps that level stable, and if that level's stable, it makes their work easier because it's targetable. And the Fed is forced to supply them according to its legal mandate, and it looks like they've got to do that anyway, because when they were set up, that's what it's in their mandate to do so. Anyway, in short, reserves are about helping to set interest rates, not about pyramiding money on reserve base. This is the old thing that I told you to try and forget, all things about fraction reserve lending. And it's got nothing to do with that. The reserves are purely for the Fed to drive the Fed funds rate. It's got bugger all to do with fractional reserve lending. Let's just put in any more. Even if it did in the past, we can forget it. It's just a tool for the Fed to get the Fed funds target rate hit as accurately as possible. Under present institutional arrangements, the Fed funds rate is dependent on the Fed's supplying the required amount of reserves at any given reserve ratio to keep the interest rate at its target within its target band. Repeat what I just said. The Fed can't target a rate unless it supplies banks with all the reserves that the banks need to make loans at that rate. Just what I said. This means that central banks must be committed to supplying as many reserves as banks need in accordance with the lending that they do, subject to their capital constraints. Now that's just at the end of that, because you're starting to get bored. Capital constraints are the things that constrain the fountain, not reserves. But we've been through that so many times, you know that by heart. You know what capital requirements are, and you now know for sure that they do constrain lending. So in practice, if a banking system as a whole is at the reserve limit, say 50 billion, central banks will always increase the level of reserves desired by the system in order to maintain the interest rate. Now we do understand that. Not doing so means at once that the Fed cannot hit its target, or that transactions fail as the payment system breaks down. I make a loan, I take a deposit out, write a check, deposit it in bank B. What's the bank A doesn't have the reserves. What's the central bank going to do? No. So the check bounces, basically, because all that happens with that check is that one bank's deposits reserves with the Fed are transferred to the second bank's reserves at the Fed. And if the bank says that the first bank hasn't got the reserves to do it, well, where are you? You just can't do that. The Fed is forced to give the bank an overdraft, basically. In sum, in a non-convertible floating exchange rate system, the amount of credit in the system is determined by the risk-reward calculations of the banks in granting loans and the demand for those loans. Nothing the central bank is doing is constraining or encouraging bank lending. It just, when the bank lending either happens or doesn't happen, the central bank makes sure it happens smoothly and at a controlled Fed funds target rate. They are capital constrained. Big up. Financial institutions grant credit based on the capital they have to deal with losses associated with activity. They are capital constrained. And the regulators come along and tell them how constrained they are. I don't think anything I wrote is particularly controversial for those with banking and money as their primary economic discipline or area of study. That's us. Not Krugman and Mark Thomas, it looks like. No, Thomas all right. Leave him out of it. Naughty Nick. But if you read textbooks like the one I got in business school by Glenn Hubbard, you find sentences like, this is when he went to economics school, the monetary base sometimes is called high-powered money, because a given amount of base allows the creation of multiple amounts of money. And that was in Hubbard. But that's just an iteration of fractional reserve lending, which is old and gone. This suggests that banks in fact are pyramiding credit money creation on the back of reserves, when this is now not the case. I checked into college economic textbooks by Baumol and Blinder 1985, and it's exactly the same type of stuff. So that's what the economic kids will be learning now. The same old, gone stuff. The reality is that banks are not reserve constrained because the Fed must supply reserves to back the loans already granted. Only if and when the Fed decides to raise the Fed funds rate to curtail credit growth will reserves be constrained, and they will be demand constrained, not supply constrained. Now, I'll call that the end of the first chapter. I might go on and do a second one on the second half of Ed's posting there, if I've got the energy to do it, because it's quite hard work going along with this sort of stuff. Hopefully this is useful. But with what Fulwiler said, what Ed's saying here, and hopefully my explanations help, we should be getting a really grokked idea of what the central banking system is all about. I might see you again later with another one. Or not. We'll see. Bye.